History is being written right in front of our eyes. On June 9, 2024, the long-standing petrodollar agreement between Saudi Arabia and the United States officially expired, and Saudi Arabia announced that they do not plan to renew it. At first glance, it might seem like just another economic maneuver between nations, but in reality, this moment could become one of the most consequential turning points in global economics, something capable of reshaping the entire world order. So what was this agreement in the first place? Exactly 50 years ago, the United States went to Saudi Arabia with a proposal. You will sell your oil only in US dollars, and in return, we'll provide you with security, advanced weapons, and access to American technology. Saudi Arabia weighed the pros and cons and eventually agreed. And in 1974, the famous petrodollar pact between Saudi Arabia and the US was signed, the agreement that became the very foundation of the petrodollar system. From that moment on, if you wanted to buy oil, you first had to buy US dollars, simple as that. By the way, what comes to mind when you hear the word currency? Most people today immediately think about the US dollar. For the majority of the world, that green bill is the ultimate symbol of money, but it hasn't always been this way. For example, if you asked someone between 1720 and 1815 what the world's reserve currency was, they would have said the French livre. And from around 1815 to 1920, the answer would have been the British pound sterling. So the dominance of the US dollar in people's minds today is simply the result of decades of historical and economic events. But what events exactly? In 1944, nations signed the Bretton Woods Agreement, which essentially made the global financial system revolve around the US dollar, not only around gold, as before. It's not that countries were desperate to help America rise. It's just that after World War II, the United States was basically the only stable superpower left, with a functioning economy. And stability was exactly what the world needed after such a devastating conflict. To rebuild international trade, countries needed one crucial thing: a single currency everyone trusted. On top of that, the American banking system at the time was the most reliable in the world. So nations stored their wealth in dollars to protect themselves from inflation. This is why Japan, China, and the UK became some of the largest holders of US assets, together accumulating $7 to $8 trillion in reserves. But there was something else that helped the US become the world's most influential superpower: control over global energy. Remember, in 1971, the US decided, unilaterally, to print money without backing it with gold. Before that, people didn't really need dollars. Everything was valued in gold. After 1944, the dollar became the world's currency, but it was still pegged to gold. And here came the problem. The US didn't have enough gold to cover all the dollars it was printing. If every dollar holder suddenly asked the US to exchange their money for gold, America simply wouldn't have been able to do it. And guess what? Something close to that actually happened. In 1965, Charles de Gaulle, the president of France, openly protested the dollar's dominance. He demanded that the US exchange $1.5 billion held by France for gold. At the time, the rate was $35 per troy ounce. So France requested an enormous amount, 16.5 tons of gold, nearly 3/4 of the US gold reserve. You can imagine Washington's reaction. And coincidentally, within just a few years, the US decided it no longer needed gold at all. America ended the gold standard unilaterally, switching to a floating currency system where the dollar had absolute dominance. Was this even allowed? Well, yes and no. This decision had serious consequences. President Richard Nixon simply informed the entire world that dollars could no longer be converted into gold. Naturally, this raised huge doubts about the real value of the dollar. The economy fell into stagnation, inflation soared, and oil-exporting countries grew nervous. The value of oil contracts, priced in dollars, began to fall. And then came another major problem. The Arab-Israeli War broke out, and Arab nations were furious about Western support for Israel. Tensions escalated, and in 1973, Arab OPEC members raised crude oil prices by 70% and imposed an embargo on exports to the US and other Western countries. What happened next? A full-blown oil crisis. Nixon urged Americans to save fuel. Airlines cut flights and fuel prices skyrocketed. The U.S. desperately needed a solution, and that brings us right back to the oil for dollars agreement with Saudi Arabia, the same agreement mentioned at the beginning. It became one of the key steps in ending the oil crisis. There is an old Arabic saying, "Our home is your home," and as the sands shift with time, they give us one clear message about the future. The friendship between the people of Saudi Arabia and the United States will only grow stronger. "We will become a powerful and vital force in the world," declared the Saudi king during that historic speech. So, if the dollar could no longer be backed by gold, it needed another foundation to maintain global stability. Gold was replaced by black gold, oil, and that was one of the smartest strategic moves in global economic history. Just think about it. Every country that needed energy needed dollars first. That's the true power of the petrodollar system. The dollar needed a resource to preserve its global stability. Gold was replaced by oil, a strategic economic move. The petrodollar system became the core mechanism for America's superpower status. Nixon promised Saudi Arabia military protection for selling oil only in US dollars. Countries needed US dollars to trade oil, a flawless strategy. This allowed the US to dominate global trade and maintain the dollar as the world's reserve currency. In 2024, Saudi Arabia announced it would not renew this petrodollar agreement. Reuters reported Saudi Arabia joined China's digital currency project, mBridge. mBridge has already reached a minimum viable product. The technology is operational. The rejection of the US dollar in international trade is becoming a global trend. China and Russia now conduct over 90% of their mutual trade in national currencies. As Congressman Thomas Massey stated, "They're going to stop using our dollars as a reserve currency." Before the sanctions on Russia, 70% of their transactions were in US dollars. After the sanctions, less than 20%. Ironically, every time the US government introduces new economic sanctions, the world takes one more step toward de-dollarization. And now it's time to mention another important development. BRICS is launching its own payment system, BRICS Bridge. It is still under development, but the potential is huge. The alliance aims to build a digital, blockchain-based payment infrastructure, with transactions that are highly secure, highly private, and resistant to control from foreign governments. And yes, the foreign government implied here is the United States. Between 2013 and 2023, the share of the Russian ruble in export settlements nearly tripled, reaching 39%. BRICS countries are actively expanding the use of their national currencies in foreign trade, strengthening the security and efficiency of these operations. They are also working on forming a fully independent global payment system, one that cannot be influenced by political pressure or external interference. Saudi Arabia wants to join BRICS as well. Officially, they're not a member yet, but they're already participating in meetings, and according to Russian Deputy Foreign Minister Sergei Ryabkov, they are working alongside everyone else. And BRICS has ambitious plans. First, the alliance wants to reform the global financial system, giving more influence and economic independence to developing nations. It's obvious that under the current dollar-centric system, every country is effectively dependent on decisions made by the US government. That's one of the biggest motivations behind the BRICS initiative. This is why creating an independent payment system is such a crucial step. Second, BRICS countries continue to support the idea of statehood for Palestine within the Israel-Palestine conflict. Look at this map. All the green countries recognize Palestinian statehood, and they represent almost 88% of the world's population. And almost all of these same nations support de-dollarization and the rise of BRICS. The war in Gaza has become another major political factor separating BRICS and the United States. The US will always support Israel, while BRICS supports Palestinian statehood, something that most of the world's population also favors. Third, BRICS wants to challenge US sanctions. BRICS ministers argue that unilateral Western sanctions violate the principles of the United Nations and harm global economic growth, energy markets, healthcare, and food security, especially in developing countries. The idea of a multipolar world is becoming more attractive to nations seeking economic freedom, control, and independence from U.S. dominance. The United States is clearly feeling the pressure of losing its financial dominance. But the question is, does the American economy rely only on the global demand for its currency? What does the U.S. actually contribute to the global economy? Let's compare. China is known as the world's manufacturing hub, producing and exporting almost everything. Germany is famous for engineering excellence. BMW, Porsche, Mercedes. Japan exports electronics and cars, Toyota, Honda, and yes, the best anime in the world. South Korea is known for semiconductors, Samsung gadgets, Hyundai and Kia cars, and top-tier cosmetics. Saudi Arabia is famous for its oil, one of the largest crude exporters on the planet. Russia is rich in natural resources, natural gas, oil, coal, and other minerals. Brazil is known for agriculture, soybeans, coffee, sugar, beef. India exports software, technology, pharmaceuticals. Australia is rich in natural resources, iron ore, coal, natural gas, and black opal. Canada exports timber and minerals. France leads the world in luxury goods. Italy has Ferrari, Lamborghini, world-class wine and pasta. The Netherlands exports flowers, dairy, and vegetables. Switzerland dominates financial services, pharmaceuticals, and watchmaking. So what about the United States? Hollywood candy bars, military equipment. And of course, many products consumed worldwide are made under American brands, culture and technology being some of the biggest. But perhaps the most important export of the United States is something else entirely: the US dollar itself. This is what keeps America's economy afloat. If the whole world needs your money, your economy thrives. Third, BRICS wants to challenge U.S. sanctions. BRICS ministers argue that unilateral Western sanctions violate the principles of the United Nations and harm global economic growth, energy markets, healthcare, and food security, especially in developing countries. The idea of a multipolar world is becoming more attractive to nations seeking economic freedom, control, and independence from U.S. Treasury bonds. And this demand fueled American economic growth for decades. It led to economic stability, low interest rates, and high liquidity in U.S. financial markets. But without the ability to export dollars to the rest of the world, none of this would be possible. The U.S. economy resembles a balloon. Imagine the balloon deflated. That's the American economy in its normal state. Every time a problem arises, the U.S. government pumps more money into the economy. More money means more inflation. If the pumping continues endlessly, the balloon eventually bursts. That would be economic collapse, because consumers could no longer afford anything. So why hasn't this happened to America? Because the U.S. has a pressure release valve. It releases excess dollars into the rest of the world, and the world needs those dollars to buy energy. The system works, but only as long as that valve keeps functioning. But what happens if suddenly the world no longer needs such a large flow of US dollars? Correct, the balloon bursts. We've already seen what happens in countries with collapsing currencies. Greece, on the brink of default. Syria, where 4 out of 5 people now live in poverty. Lebanon, where the currency has lost more than 90% of its value. Argentina, with annual inflation surpassing 100% for the first time since 1991. Basic goods doubling in price. This kind of situation puts enormous strain on federal budgets. People pay more taxes, interest rates surge, banks go bankrupt. And if the dollar suddenly loses its global demand, the consequences for everyday Americans would be immediate. A weaker dollar means foreign goods become dramatically more expensive. Travel becomes more expensive. Imports skyrocket in price. The average American's purchasing power drops sharply. This is why Saudi Arabia's decision is so important for the global economy. Right now, the US dollar, as a reserve currency, is at its lowest share in years. The big question is, how can the US fight this trend? Yes, they can raise the federal funds rate. And that's exactly what the Federal Reserve has been doing to attract more capital. But interest rates can only be raised to a certain point before the pain becomes too much. Consumers suffer, small banks fail, borrowing becomes nearly impossible, the domestic economy slows down, so the outlook is not great. But it's still too early to bury the US economy. We must admit, American currency still has massive global power. About 59% of the world's foreign exchange reserves are in US dollars. The US dollar has been the leader in the global financial system since the 1920s. The euro holds 20% of global foreign exchange reserves, while the Chinese yuan accounts for only 3%. The dollar is used in 88% of all foreign exchange transactions worldwide. Recently, 73 central banks reduced their yuan holdings. These banks increased their gold and dollar reserves, highlighting trust in these assets. The dollar is backed by the largest military force, adding security. How long will this dominance last? The world is becoming less dependent on the dollar. Saudi Arabia's decision to settle oil deals in non-dollar currencies confirms this global shift. What do you think? How much will the global financial system change? What future awaits the US dollar in the coming years? Thanks for watching and supporting our work.